to support the production of today's radio program, and to access extended episodes, please visit okpodcast.com/subscribe. Thank you and enjoy the show.
That's one of the things they do so great is, you can ascribe meaning and names to the way they write their songs, but truly understanding how they do it, I think there's a little bit of magic in there.
You're listening to OK Podcast, a podcast by Sean Perrin about Radiohead. Welcome back to OK Podcast, the show for Radiohead fans. I want to say that it has been a while since I've recorded an episode. Life has definitely got in the way, but I've been inspired to come back to it because Zach and I recorded this episode sometime last year, just before the Kid A Mnesia album came out. And we talked about a lot of great things, and also Zach has decided to start his own Radiohead podcast with his brother called IdioTalk. It's a great name, and I also think the more the merrier. The more people talking about Radiohead and listening to Radiohead, the better. So I do welcome them into the podcast space, and I do want to say that I'm going to be starting this show back up because I logged in and the numbers are amazing. The last episode had a couple thousand listens, so thank you to those all over the world for listening to the show, and I will be back with some more content soon. If you do want to let me know what kind of content you enjoy or guests you'd like to see, or you'd like to apply to come on the show yourself, you can send me a message at hello@okpodcast.com. Today's guest is, like I said, Zach Glenn, who is not only a Radiohead fan, but also a Patreon supporter of the podcast, so thank you so much for that. But he's been a fan for a long time, and we talk about a lot of really interesting things, all the way from the then unreleased Kid A Mnesia, like I was saying, why Zach's favorite album is Hail to the Thief, and why I am rather controversially not a huge fan of In Rainbows, and a lot more on today's episode. I do hope that you enjoyed this episode of the show, and there's no ads today because I don't feel like putting ads on the podcast anymore. So if you'd like to throw a few dollars and cents my way and help out, then please do consider supporting on Patreon, but ain't nobody got time for that. No ads on today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. So I'm here today with Zach Glenn, who's coming to the podcast from Sacramento, California. Zach, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Sean.
So just before we went on air, we were just talking about this brand new release that's come out. So we're just going to continue the conversation from there, and then we're going to get into stuff. But we just both learned about this last week, and I bet if you're listening to this episode today, you're also really excited about that. So it's called Kid Amnesia, or Kid A Mnesia, or I'm not really sure how to say it, but Zach was kind enough to actually text me and let me know about the track that was available publicly to listen to. So what did you think about that, Zach?
I thought it was really good. What was it called again?
If you say the word.
If you say the word, yeah. To me, right away I was struck by how, like, just some of the striking similarities between All I Need and Nude. And I think at first for some reason I have those songs kind of merged as one in my mind, even though they're totally different. I thought it was a good song. It was nice and calm. I wasn't expecting like Body Snatchers or Paranoid Android Part 2 or something, really, really raucous and driving. But I don't mean to extrapolate too much out here, but like I was just thinking, man, I know that for a lot of their songs, like I know that they've been working on them for a long time, and then they kind of developed into this other thing. And I was wondering, because I feel like so little is known about their writing process, and I was curious if maybe this song eventually evolved into Nude or something like that. I had heard that there are several iterations of songs that it actually occurred with, but regardless, it was a great song. It was so exciting to hear something that I hadn't heard before.
Yeah, it's crazy to hear something fresh 20 years later. And I think you're right. I got a lot of In Rainbows-y vibes from it. And I think that might be why it sort of didn't make those sessions. There's even a lyric that says something about if you're caught in rainbows. And I thought that was really kind of interesting. But for me, I almost felt like, and this might be controversial, but I sort of thought, and I still think as I listen to it, that it almost could have replaced something like Optimistic on Kid A, just to kind of keep the vibe a little more kind of in that space. Because Optimistic for me is the one track that always stands out as not very Kid A-ish, even though I love it. It's kind of your more generic kind of pop song, sort of, although it wasn't very radio popular back in the day. But I don't know. I'm very hesitant to touch Kid A and change it at all. But yeah, really excited about this new material. If you're listening to the show here and you haven't heard of that yet somehow, I don't know how you could be a Radiohead fan and not have heard about it yet, but do head over to Radiohead's website and Twitter and Instagram and their TikTok and all that stuff, and you can check out some of the teasers for that. And if you're like me, you probably ordered a bunch of crap you don't need, a bunch of CDs for a CD player you don't have,
Same.
stuff like that. But anyway, so Zach, let's get into it, get to know you a little bit. That's some Radiohead news update, I guess. Where are you? Tell me a little about yourself and what got you into Radiohead.
Yeah. So like you were saying, I'm in Sacramento, California. That's in the northern half of our big state. Over the last, year and a half or so, I've been kind of living like the rest of us, working from home. I'm really, really fortunate to be able to do that. And, I've always loved Radiohead and really tried to do as much of a deep dive as within my grasp on their music. I knew there was something distinctly different about them in comparison to other artists that maybe carry that level of fame or have as much of a following as they do. But I didn't quite know why. And, I would say one of the things that's been really neat and I've been afforded the luxury to do, in the last year and a half is kind of read up on them and enhance my, just my understanding of music as a whole, not just as it pertains to Radiohead, but I read Brad Osborne's book. I think you had him on the show. That was a really, really cool episode, Everything in Its Right Place. And he really unpacks sort of just the unconventional things that they do. I don't want to go on and on, but everyone should read that book if they're a big fan of Radiohead. He's, very, very educated guy, though, and the way he breaks it down. I wish I could say I understood every single thing in the book, but that's kind of the cool thing about those sorts of books. People musicologists that have dedicated their lives to, or at least their careers, to understanding music at a deeper level. And you can always go back and reread something if it didn't resonate the first time. So I read his book probably 2.5 times over the last year. And then in doing so, found this podcast, found that there's like a whole community of people that like to discuss their music and what they do in terms of songwriting and instrumentation and all of that at a deeper level. And, I've loved the band for the last 13 and a half years. Would say kind of them and the Beatles occupy the top spot, depending on the month. Yeah, I feel good at age 32 and 13 and a half years saying like they are my favorite band. I feel like so much can fluctuate in that time for really anyone. Your tastes really evolve and change, but Radiohead have occupied that top spot for so many years. And I know you're a huge Kid A fan. I am as well. And that's what's so fun is like which one of their albums and stage in their career, that's always evolving. But, it's never really like, oh, this band is going to slide in and take up as much mental energy as Radiohead does in a good way.
You're totally right. I think that my favorite album definitely is Kid A. But what is yours? What is your kind of favorite Radiohead era?
Ooh, I would have to say Hail to the Thief is my favorite. And my brother likes to make fun of me that like I've chosen that just to be a contrarian, although I'm sure there's a whole group of people, out there that are Hail to the Thief people. But yeah, I would say that album is my favorite just because it does have some problems. It might be a little overly long, but I think it really is just this wonderful distillation of the sort of bifurcated halves that came before it. So you have like Radiohead, Pablo Honey, The Bends, OK Computer, and then you have Kid A and Amnesiac. And those are such distinctly different styles of music and really almost a different band in a way. And I think Hail to the Thief sort of like picks and pulls from both those styles of music that they had before it. And I would say In Rainbows does the same thing. But for whatever reason, Hail to the Thief really, really strikes a chord with me in that way. I think it just opens up with that first song and you go, oh, okay, I'm in for something different. But it's not OK Computer or The Bends, even though it rocks and has, guitars and a lot of more distinctly Radiohead drum and bass. But it's too weird to have been in that OK Computer Bends era, right? Especially that song. I mean, that clues you in right away. Oh, okay, I'm in for something different. And In Rainbows does the same thing, but it has a sense of calm and just a sense of calm that I would say isn't there with Hail to the Thief.
Yeah, I think Hail to the Thief is incredibly agitated. And I think that you're right. I think that, to me, there's like 4 Radiohead eras. I don't know if this is really technically correct, and it's funny because for me, the first album, Pablo Honey, occupies the first era. It's just their kind of grunge sound, their start, right? The second one is kind of their popish writing, like almost like Oasis to me, Coldplay-ish. So it was The Bends. Third one was more experimental, kind of like prog rock type thing, OK Computer. But then we get into what I would call the Kid A era, which is just like experimentation, right? And anything that kind of comes after that, I'm not really sure. I guess it would be its own fifth era, but I'm not really sure where it lands into as much. However, I think that you're right in saying that Hail to the Thief is kind of a culmination of those first three, which made its own kind of unique sound. But in Rainbows, it's odd because to me it went a little more accessible than I would have liked.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a good call. I think like House of Cards and weirdly 15 Step, even though I know 15 Step is in like a five time. I mean, I know it's a little bit more complicated than that, but it is in an unconventional pace, right? I mean, you don't hear a lot of pop songs in 5 time, and that song was on the Twilight soundtrack, so it is definitively, you know, they're in the zeitgeist as a well-known band if you're on the Twilight soundtrack. But I think there are a couple songs that are like, wow, this is really, really accessible for Radiohead, which is a good thing, right?
Yeah, it's interesting they went that way. I mean, but for me, I guess as a Kid A kind of fan who really loved, if anything, the layering and the depth to that music, it was not something that came to me in the same way on in Rainbows. And I think part of it is that, you know, like Brad Osborne was saying in the Everything in Its Right Place interview, in Rainbows tends to push song forms using a more traditional instrumentation, whereas Kid A, Amnesiac, Hail to the Thief were more about like experimental sounds. Like, you know, you're listening to Arpeggi, for example, and I guess from a guitar standpoint, yeah, it's very intricate, very interesting, but there's simply not as many layers as there was in like a song like National Anthem. You know, the different horns and the Ons Martineau and all these different instruments and sounds, and so I just found that upon repeated listens, I always wanted Radiohead to kind of expose something new to me, and in Rainbows just is not on that same wavelength in that way. Maybe there's other ways, but yeah, I think we're both kind of outsiders though, because it does seem for some reason that In Rainbows has become definitely a fan favorite, and it's kind of a heinous crime to not have it as your favorite album, it seems sometimes. But yeah, I've only met a few people though who are like you and prefer Hail to the Thief to everything else, so that's great.
Well, I think not to like go down the rabbit hole too much, but in Rainbows, what's so interesting to me is that volume 2 disc of the songs that just like, you know, didn't make the cut, or, you know, for whatever reason, who knows why, because they're certainly refined. I think that I would trade 3 of those songs on volume 2 and put them on volume 1, and it would totally be my favorite album. Like Down is the New Up, Go Slowly, and Up on the Ladder, though. Up on the Ladder is such a nice return to form. It may be a little bit too simple to be a Radiohead song that they released, but I think if those songs were to have been on the original one and maybe replaced like Weird Fishes, some of those kind of more, or House of Cards as well, then it would definitively occupy #1 spot. But that's just me.
It's so funny you say that, because just before we got on this call, for some reason I was re-listening to In Rainbows Disc 2, I think because you mentioned it in one of your emails, and I wanted to re-familiarize myself with it today. And I had the exact same thought. If Down is the New Up was on there and Go Slowly was on In Rainbows, and maybe swapped out for a couples like Faust Arp and a couple other ones, I actually could have seen it more elevated to me. I think that it kind of, and maybe it's a good thing, like you said, it really did drop the darker vibe that was there for Kid A, Amnesiac, Hail to the Thief, and really OK Computer in a way. Very kind of dark, I don't want to say depressed, angry albums, but that is kind of what they were. Whereas in Rainbows was kind of more of a, I don't know, breath of fresh air in a way. But yeah, I think I totally agree with you on that. Some of those B-sides were great. I saw some of those B-sides live, actually, but it's always funny what people say as far as which songs could go. Because when you said Arpeggi could go, I was like, oh, no. That's one of the best ones on In Rainbows. But I would say that Jigsaw could go, and people would kill me for that. You just gasped for real, you know?
Song off of In Rainbows for sure. But yeah, I mean, that's the cool thing, is we're coming at it from a place of just, I would say, just love and admiration of their whole body of work. So once you're kind of there with the person, it's so interesting to discover like which tracks and which albums speak to people, because you are both coming at it. We're not talking about, are they a good band and do I like them? It's more just like, which songs speak to them. And that point, it is all personal taste. But I just love hearing that. It's so interesting.
So you mentioned in an email to me that They're There and Jigsaw are your 2 favorite tracks. Do you want to go into that a little bit? And
Sure, yeah. They're There. I have such a distinct memory of hearing it for the first time, because in my like Radiohead listening journey, you know, over a span of about a year from 2007 to 2008, I like weirdly worked in bite-sized chunks. And I didn't go chronologically, but I remember distinctly just hearing that song and being so blown away at sort of just like the simplicity of the first 2 minutes and 55 seconds, right before he goes into, go into the coda of the Why So Green and Lonely. And it's so cool because I think that the first, we'll just round up and say 3 minutes could easily be, like a really, really great Coldplay song or something like that. Not to demean Coldplay at all, but I think there is definitely some comparisons that people rightly make to them as an inferior Radiohead. I'm not saying that, but but yeah, I mean, it could be just a great, great pop song. It has this sort of bright musical tone to it. The lyrics are really sweet. And then right when Tom York, kind of does this war cry of "They're there," there's definitely just a switch. And the picking or the chord progression that they use, Brad Osborne talks about it in his book and kind of breaks it down, really, really intellectually. But it doesn't sound good if you just try and play it, on your guitar, or even if you have like a great recording setup. It's something that only they could do. They do it quite a lot. It's called negative harmony, and for those that are interested and want to look at it, but it's probably Tom York's, I think, greatest vocal performance that they did in the studio, or it's at least my favorite. I don't know if it's his greatest, but those vocal harmonies are just so unbelievably great. It really, really has a darkness that works with the chord progression that wasn't there before. So I don't know that you could call it word painting specifically, but I would say that the shift that occurs is so distinct and really, really matches the negative harmony that he and Johnny Greenwood do. And it has just such remnants of Radiohead that we hadn't heard for a couple albums, with Johnny Greenwood's solo. I don't know if you could even call it a guitar solo, but there's a lot of things that we hadn't gotten to hear as listeners for a long time with the previous two albums and its Attack. And inevitably the first thing a lot of people do is look at live performances to see, gosh, could this band capture this magic that was on the album? And I think they do. And I think it's just so cool to see that Ed O'Brien and Johnny Greenwood are playing a miniature drum setup, for the first 3 minutes of the song. They go so far to replicate that magic that's on the album live. And, it just goes to show you just how dedicated these guys are as musicians, to expanding their own repertoire. It's not that what they're doing on the drums is that complicated, but it's so cool that they don't have a guest drummer on there, for that particular song. They have the whole band doing their thing to make sure that it sounds great. And the other thing I've discovered about that song that's so cool is Colin Greenwood, I would say really on Hail to the Thief and in Rainbows, gets a chance to just shine. And it's not that he's doing anything, overly complex, but the bass working in tandem with the drums, it's really the first instrument you hear, the first stringed instrument you hear, before the guitar even comes in with the feedback. And that's spoken to me recently over the last year or two, is like, man, Colin gets a lot to do in this song, and not just in the background. You can hear it, really closely.
Yeah, I think Colin is a very underrated part of Radiohead, and along with Phil. I mean, I think Phil is one of the most. But, I want to go into this negative harmony. What exactly do you mean by that? I haven't heard that term before.
In There, for instance, what they're doing is a chord progression of B minor, D minor, to A minor, to E minor. So B minor is relative major, is D major, right? But when you have B minor and D minor butted up right against one another, it's going to sound really kind of, not necessarily ugly, but it's going to sound very unnatural if you don't have a pivot chord in between, right? Because you're not fully changing keys, but you're going from one to the other without anything to help your ear understand how you got there. And there are other bands in popular music that have done this. It's really prevalent in like classical music, because you're not having to reconcile vocals and just a regular song structure over it. But the way Radiohead and the Beatles do it, like "Happiness Is a Warm Gun" is an example where the Beatles did it. They just understand music and understand vocally, I would say, what York can do is really, really tremendous, to where they don't necessarily need that pivot chord. And I would encourage anyone to just sit down and just play that chord progression and see if you can make it work yourself. And it's very, very challenging. But the way they have everything building and what they understand that they can do as a band, I think, is what makes it work. because I think inherently you know that something is different about this chord progression or about the melody, I should just say, but you can't quite place why. And, I don't know that I could really explain it. It's hard when you have a musical concept and you go, well, that's that. And you go, okay, well, I'm glad that I know what it is now, but I still, find it odd. And I think that's one of the things they do so great is, you can ascribe meaning and names to the way they write their songs, but truly understanding how they do it, I think there's a little bit of magic in there.
Totally. Do you think that's one of the reasons that they're kind of not sometimes as commercially successful as they could be? Like whether people realize it or not, like the ear needs to really kind of listen to it different than a normal pop song. You know what I mean? Like,
oh, totally. I totally think that's why. I mean, I think that a lot of times, like, and this even goes back to my initial reaction to when my older brother showed me In Rainbows, is like puzzled. Not like, oh, I don't like this, or oh, this isn't good by any means, but you just kind of, when people feel puzzled or confused by things, a lot of times the automatic response is to reject it or to say they dislike it, right? Because things that are hard to understand, often are met with, oh, I don't like that. Well, why don't you like it? Well, because it's, I can't intuitively explain why I didn't even like it maybe, or what was weird about it. People say, oh, that's weird, And I think, sometimes that might be why, I wouldn't say they have trouble, but why, from pretty much OK Computer onward, there was a lot of skepticism met with like radio stations and so forth, like, gosh, can we even play this? And, I think Alan Cross has talked about on his podcast or on yours, I can't recall, that, the resounding reaction was by the radio station, yes, we have to play this 6-minute, 30 seconds long song. But I do think, that since OK Computer onward, that's why maybe a lot of listeners kind of react with a little bit of skepticism, because you can't quite put your finger on what is weird about it. But it is different.
Well, it's interesting too, because I can understand why some people just want to like put on music and, for example, relax or feel happy or whatever. But these are very simplistic things. And it reminds me of, I was just reading the other day, I started the book called Tools of Titans by Tim Ferriss. He basically took all his podcast interviews and put them into a book where you can learn some of the lessons. It's kind of cool. But he says at the beginning of the book, it's like 1,000 pages long. But he says, as you go through, feel free to skip stuff that you're not interested in. But all I ask is that you like put a dot in the corner of the page. And then one day you come back to that and go, why did I skip this? Did it make me uncomfortable? If so, why? Why wasn't I interested in this? Am I interested now? And I wish more people would do that with music. Like even people who are Radiohead fans, for example, or more kind of classical minded or classically or jazz educated, they tend to really dismiss a lot of pop music, right? Like one time a guy told me, a classically trained musician that I know, he said something like, oh yeah, I mean, I can't stand all that top 40 crap. And I was like, well, I mean, okay, but why? Is it the instrumentation? I mean, I challenge you. And he said, oh, it's just too simple. And I said, well, I mean, man, I challenge you to write even one song like that ever in your whole life. Most people can't do it. It's incredibly hard.
Well, that's a great like kind of exercise to go through with a lot of things. Like, with bad movies, for instance, like you can have quote unquote good taste in movies and understand story structure and arc or, and all those things. But it doesn't mean that you should stop watching movies that might be quote unquote bad. Your taste can evolve over time, and you can say, oh, I watched the trailer for that, or, based on the genre, and I can tell that I might not get anything out of it. But I would challenge people, myself included, to, if it's something that you really want to delve deep into, whether it's music, movies, or some form of, pop culture, media, or other, it's not good to just dismiss things, like you were saying, just because you might understand what is quote unquote better or might have a little bit more, written into it. I think if anything, it helps you enhance your understanding of what is good by, and I'm not encouraging people to waste a bunch of time watching bad movies or things like that, but I do think it's really, really important to, like you were talking about with that person, to listen to pop music instead of just deeming it as bad. At least give it a once over,
Well, it goes both ways. I mean, pop musicians should listen to some classical too, and they'll find out that it's not all just about relaxing. For example, there's this idea that classical music is just something to put on while you're trying to study or sleep, and not the classical music I've played. I mean, you try sleeping to Also Sprach der Thustra or something, and or maybe the Firebird or something like that. You're going to be kept quite awake.
Oh yeah, I mean, gosh, and I mean, I think that goes back to Radiohead so well, is that you can really, really hear, because so little is known about their musical education of sorts. I know people know that Johnny Greenwood is a classically trained musician and can read notation and all of that. And Tom York says he cannot, right? But okay, but he's clearly a brilliantly talented musician. And I would love to know sort of what their education process was in between like Pablo Honey and the Bends, because even though the Bends is still very much a pop album that could potentially be, on the level of Oasis or some other bands of that era, there's such a distinct shift that took place. I would want to know, like, gosh, did they just spend hours a day with each other reading these books or listening to classical music? What occurred? What was the event, so to speak, that really helped them grow their understanding? Because by the time you get into Kid A and Amnesiac, it is so distinctly obvious that they were really, really interested in like jazz, for instance, especially on Amnesiac. Life in a Glass House, and there's one other track on there. I can't remember the name of it now, but maybe even Pyramid Song. I think you can hear a lot of jazz influence. So yeah, I would love to know what their own influence process is like. If they just listen to music, if they, Johnny Greenwood specifically read a bunch of books, because there was clearly a massive quantum leap forward in terms of understanding.
That's an interesting point, especially considering that there were 5 band members who all had to move together in this. I mean, thinking back to that era, like, okay, wait, they're what are they, 18 or 20 when they started Pablo Honey? And so we're talking about guys in their 20s that went from basically creating grunge music to creating like some sort of avant-garde pop music within 7 years, So they must have had some of the same influences that whole time, but chose to express it in different ways.
Yeah, and I think Nigel Godrich probably plays like he's, I guess the 6th member of the band. If you're going with like Beatles analogies, they said George Martin was the 5th Beatle, and I think that's got to be up to him, because I don't think he started as a full-time producer until OK Computer. But I think, like I was saying, with in between Pablo Honey and the Bends, there is a distinct leap forward. Maybe not a quantum leap forward, but I think about songs like My Iron Lung, maybe Street Spirit, although that song's not overly complex, but you can really hear like some different influences and just a massive amount of growth. And it is possible to grow as a band. I mean, they obviously probably bonded a ton, the amount of touring they did, but that's something I don't know that we'll ever know, what their writing process or influence process is like, but it's always really fun to speculate for sure.
Totally, yeah. And it's funny because I often can hear, this is an odd thing I think, but I can hear forwards in Radiohead, but not always backwards. I guess what I mean by that is that in the Bends, I can kind of hear where Kid A came from, but I don't really hear the Bends in Kid A. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a really good point.
Like there's little snippets of stuff, which I don't know if that thought really makes sense. Maybe it doesn't, but
no, it does. I think that like, it's very complimentary, because they're not one to retread old ground, which is a reason I love them. We kind of stopped in the categorization of our favorite albums at In Rainbows, but we shouldn't forget that there are 2 albums after that. And I think maybe those albums are a little bit, specifically King of Limbs, I think is an example of not trying new things is bad, but trying just a whole new approach towards music, and what they've done might not produce something that is the most fun to listen to. And, I think that they're incredibly focused on percussion in King of Limbs. That's what's super obvious. I don't know that they'd ever been so specific in their focus on albums before, like this is the bass album, or this is the guitar album. I think that may have occurred kind of accidentally. Like you could say Kid A and Amnesiac are like, these are the electronic albums, but I don't think they set out to make it that way. And I think King of Limbs feels like it was set out to be focused on the percussive sort of aspect of Radiohead that we hadn't gotten a lot of before. And I don't know that that's like my favorite thing to listen to about them, even though I totally agree. Phil Selway, I'm not sure how to say it. Is it Selway?
Phil Selway, yeah.
He's such a terrific, underrated drummer. I do agree with you there. But I know Tom York plays drums actually on a lot of the songs, which is interesting.
Well, a lot of them, King of Limbs is so strange because to me it's kind of like this album that I always forget about almost. But when I listen to it, I always like it. Just not as much as the others. It doesn't quite touch the same sort of nerve with me. But what always blew my mind about it is how short it is. I just can't get over it. It's only 8 tracks. I guess that's really all that they could maybe pull with that sound. But shortly after, they came out with great songs like These Are My Twisted Words and that Hairy Patch or whatever it was called. Just really nice stuff kind of came out around the same era. And I was like, why didn't they just wait a little bit longer and kind of get a better album together,
Well, yeah, I mean, we've had 5 years now, which it does feel like 5 years and it doesn't, but I know it was 5 years between King of Limbs and A Moon-Shaped Pool. So yeah, it's about time. And I mean, I'm so excited that we're getting this Kid Amnesiac album, but it's not the same as if they put together a new album. But we can speculate about the future later.
Well, you know, some people are disappointed by this Kid Amnesia thing, and I guess to some extent, maybe I am a little bit in a weird way, but I guess I wasn't really sure what to expect. And in a way, I kind of got what I'd hoped for. I mean, I had heard they had a bunch of tape that was left on the cutting room floor, and they had a ton of extra material. And I think it sounds like we're getting, about 15 tracks extra? I mean, that's pretty cool, although I just kind of wish they'd bundled some of the B-sides into it as well. I mean, a lot of the songs from the Kid A Amnesiac era, like Transatlantic Drawl and Cut Tooth and all that, they're not available on the LPs, although for some reason I guess they are in the cassettes, which I don't know why they even made that, but I don't know. I guess people maybe wanted a bit more of a cohesive set and maybe a remaster or something, but I don't know. I think we're lucky to get it.
Well, I'm keeping my expectations low. I mean, I think for me, what it is that I love a little bit more of a driving, intense Radiohead, even though I love their whole body of work and the various styles that they've taken. But I don't think that we're going to get a Body Snatchers or a Jigsaw Falling into Place, or, you know, just kind of those more, not those songs necessarily, but the way that those songs are really focused on the acoustics and the electric guitar at some point, but they're driving and they're fast. I think we're going to get a lot of slow melodic lines that you can maybe, kind of like we did with that first song, or I did saying it sounds like Nude, or it sounds like All I Need, but it's not going to sound like a fast-paced Radiohead.
Absolutely. You know, I haven't asked this question before on the show, but I think I'm about to ask it, and I think I'm going to ask it of more guests in the future because I think it's a good one. But, you know, Radiohead's explored a lot of different kind of genres and sounds, but what's one that they haven't explored that you wish they would?
It's hard because I feel like they have explored so many different, but I would say like maybe a little bit more growling of the vocals. Like the only song I can think of where there's a vocal line that really surprises me is in Climbing Up the Walls, right at the end when he screams, and it's a very 1996, 97 way to kind of end a song, but it also is freaking rad. And, you know, I don't want Tom York to like thrash his voice or anything at age 50 or however old he is at this point. That's not what I'm wishing for at all, nor do I want them to venture into thrash metal territory. But I would say something with a little bit more of an edge to it would be interesting. I can't really think of anything that is within reason that they would explore that I haven't heard. And even the example I just brought up, I guess they explored it once on one song, but...
Yeah, I think for me, I'd love to see almost like an Elliott Smith style, like way more pulled back acoustic kind of sound for an album. That would be really cool. Or even like a Yes, like with longer forms.
Well, and we kind of saw that with, what's the name of that song on A Moon-Shaped Pool? Is it Present Tense?
Yeah, that one's really nice.
That to me, like, is the only thing that maybe could kind of fit in that Elliott Smith type, maybe even folksy spot. There's a song off of Hail the Thief called I Will, and that I think if the guitar was maybe acoustic, it could maybe kind of be married to that song a little bit. But yeah, that's a great call. I would love to hear that.
Almost like just an acoustic or an unplugged session or something even would be really nice just to have. So is there anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up and head on to the lightning round for the Patreon supporters, of which you are one? Thank you so much for your support of the show.
No, nothing else. I mean, those were all fantastic questions.
Yeah, man, thanks so much for coming on. And hey, if you're listening to this and you want to be like Zach and support this show, I'd encourage you to check out our Patreon community on the website at okpodcast.com. And you know what? I would like to extend this offer to anyone who wants to support the show. I would love to chat with you on the podcast as well. So if you do end up sponsoring on Patreon, you can head on there and send me a message, and I'd like to invite you on to talk to me. Of course, that extends to everyone anyway, but hey, it's always nice if you can help out the show as well, right? Anyway, so if you're listening to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else that's free, this show will end here. But if you're listening on the Patreon community, I got a couple more questions for Zach behind the scenes. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Zach.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to OK Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and tell a Radiohead friend of yours who is just as big on the band as you are about this radio program. I would love to get more people interested and involved, and I'd love to hear your story. I'd also love to hear any guest suggestions you have or any other feedback, so don't hesitate to get in touch. I do respond to every message I receive, and I love to hear from people all over the world who are listening to the show. You can contact me. My name's Sean at hello@okpodcast.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next time on OK Podcast, the show for Radiohead fans.